Hello everyone. I wanted to go over some feedback on lesson 12, which was permaculture in transition towns and regenerative agriculture review. Hopefully you enjoyed the lesson. It's one of my favorite. These are two of my favorite topics, actually three: regenerative agriculture, permaculture, and transition towns. So hopefully you got something out of it. To me, they're generally speaking very practical ways to go about your life in a more sustainable manner. And if I submit to you, if everyone, adhered to, say, the 12 permaculture principles in everything they do, we'd be in a much better situation now. The world would be a much better, friendlier, happier, more sustainable place. So hopefully you sort of take these with you moving forward. Just a couple of things I wanted to go over. Number one, the concept of adaptive resilience, which is kind of fell under the transition town content. Up to this point, we've been talking about resilience as a way to, the ability to bounce back and retain your original essential nature and character. So if you have a resilient town and, food prices go up, they're able to sort of, hold the fort, bounce back, and then, just keep on doing what they were doing before after food prices go back down. And as much as possible, not really compromise what they're doing when food prices actually are high, right? So if you grow a lot of your own food and so forth, you can weather those storms. But the idea behind adaptive resilience is that, maybe we don't want to return to that original state. Maybe that original state wasn't good for whatever reason. From a sustainability perspective, almost certainly it wasn't sustainable. So if food prices go up, and then your town or your area or your own, individually, you're like, you know what? Next time this happens, I don't want to be, deciding between, paying rent or mortgage and food. So I'm going to change the way I do things. I'm going to grow my own food. I'm going to rely less upon whatever, global food supplies. And then you adapt, right? So you're resilient, you bounce back, but you actually adapt and change to what you would probably consider a better state. So that's the idea behind adaptive resilience, which I think is an important one to think about. A couple of things about just permaculture and transition towns in general that are important to understand. Number one, they're both very solutions oriented. Hopefully you saw that. You saw a number of very practical ways that the concepts can be applied. They're also very optimistic. If you've ever hung out with a permaculturalist or a person in the transition town community, they're generally pretty optimistic. They generally have like kind of this can-do type of attitude. And they're really like, look, the problems are big, but we can do it. And let's do something about it like now. So they're very, 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 very solutions-oriented, action-oriented. Permaculturalists and transition towners do stuff. They're always doing things. They're planning the next move, and then they apply it. And they're both very grassroots oriented. So they're both like recognize that the best solutions usually come from the folks that are most impacted by those actions. And further, that the people that are sort of closest to the problem are most likely to be able to sort of have a good handle on what that problem is and how to address it. So it's very locally oriented, it's very grassroots, what we call bottom up. It promotes bottom up change, which refers to change, the people, sort of the grassroots, right? So people change, and they sort of force the change up to what other hierarchies there are in society, including the political, the economic, corporations. Like if we, for example, all choose tomorrow, everyone's like, look, I'm only buying organic food. And it's just this grassroots movement. Well, guess what's going to happen? Yeah, the companies are going to just sell organic food. It's called, that's usually called voting with your dollars, so to speak. But that's the kind of change that, the type of change, not the exact change, but the type of change that these movements advocate for. So very grassroots oriented. Both of them are very holistic, right? So they involve basically everything we've talked about this semester: food, water, energy, community design, economics, consumerism, all this stuff, social equity. they sort of like tie it all into these very holistic approaches to both like living your life, but also designing cities, designing economies, designing businesses, and so forth. So they're very holistic, very applicable across basically anything you want to do. As many of you had addressed in your permaculture principle applications, I mean, you can apply these to just about anything. And speaking of which, I just wanted to go over, I really loved your insight on these. So I'm going to go over some of your answers for applying the permaculture principles. So here's just a smattering of them. So connection is really important. So thinking about long-term implications of things that you do in the short term. So when you're planning things, you plan for the long-term impacts of them. I really like applying self-regulation and accepting feedback. This is really important. So accepting the feedback, like feedback is given to us all the time, good and ill. And the student says that when working on cars, can be challenging, and then when you're finished, you sort of receive feedback from your peers, so that next time it's easier to complete the task, right? So just like, we're not perfect, right? We're not perfect creatures as much as we'd like to be. So accepting that feedback and using it as a tool for learning is really important. Speaking of that, mistakes are tools for learning. And so this student says that mistakes are meant to happen. You learn from them, understand why it happened, and how you can better yourself. For example, in a relationship, if two people weren't meant to be together, it's okay. Learn what happened and know why it didn't work out, and then maybe something, whatever it is, you can learn from it and not make that mistake in the future. Really, really good example. Very practical. I mean, we can do this all the time. And this, to me, in my own life, I sometimes forget that I'm applying these principles, but I do stuff like that all the time. I always try to remember that if I quote-unquote fail at something, or I don't do as well at something, or like I try to get something and I don't get it, I recognize that instead of lamenting the fact that I didn't receive it, or I didn't earn it, or I didn't get whatever it is, I try to look at the bright side and say, look, let's say I'm applying for a grant or something that I want to do something with, and I don't get it. I don't get the money. Instead of saying, damn, I wish I got that grant, there's all these good things I could have done, blah, 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 blah. What I try to remember is, you know what? I learned from this. I had to put this whole proposal together, and doing that research, I learned this, and I came into this insight and that insight, and next time this proposal is going to be a lot better. And oh, by the way, there's a different grant that I could probably apply components of the one that I put forth, and use it for that. So there's, I mean, I don't want to say always, but there's really always a silver lining in any like negative or positive feedback. So I think that's really, really important. The last one I'll go over is observation. So observing is absolutely probably one of the most fundamental permaculture principles. They're always observing, like they say one of the most important tools for a permaculturalist is a hammock, right? So if you're designing a garden, like, don't just get out there and start digging. You want to sit out and relax and sort of see, observe the whole scene. Another principle is designing from patterns to details, so you sort of see how everything fits together, see where the sun is, where the water is, see where the bugs like to go. Maybe there's some, there's a groundhog family somewhere, like, notice that. Maybe something that's in the line of sight of, the front yard, and you want people to see your garden, whatever the case may be. You sit back and you observe before you act. And this student unfortunately had a story about a family pet that was that got really sick from Roundup, and ultimately, after sort of figuring out that the Roundup that people were putting in their yards was leaking into this local pond, which then the animal had imbibed, and it hurt the animal, and they sort of said, okay, look, we need to stop using these artificial pesticides. And it turns out, through observation, the student noticed that now that they've stopped using these pesticides, herbicides, that there's more sort of biodiversity in the pond. It's kind of come back to life. So that's a really important one as well. So the point is, I hope that you take these seriously moving forward, and someday, hopefully you go back to them, if not frequently. That website that has all those principles on it from Penn State, that's from Open Education Resources, so that's always available. I'd be happy to share that with you. There's a bunch of more content on there as well. Yeah, I think that's it for this lesson. Hopefully, you take away the importance of these two movements, and think of ways moving forward that you can apply them to your life, because they really do address sustainability in a really holistic manner. Okay, that's it for lesson 12.